Okay, welcome back. In the second story, we're going to give your character some movement as well as the ability to jump in the scene itself. So from the last video, I did go back and I changed the name of our idle game object to player, so you can just right click on it and rename it. In order for our character to move, we need to add a script to allow it to interact with enemies, other game objects, and so on. So to do that, with your player selected, go down to the right hand side where it says add component, and we're going to add a script. So if you type in script, it'll come up as new script. And then we want to give the script a name, so I'm going to call it player controller. You can call this player movement if you want, or whatever you want. So I'm just going to call it player controller, and then it creates the script over in the assets. So similar to what we did with the art, we want to organize our files. So we're going to create a folder and call it scripts. And then we can simply drag the player controller into the scripts folder. And now it will help to organize our files and art and scripts and so on. So for the player, if we go back to player and then in the player controller script, if you go over to the right hand side, left click, edit script, and Visual Studio will pop up. And in Visual Studio is where we're going to be doing the coding for. So with this open, we have our public class, so it's the name of the script, so it's player controller. Similar to other coding programs, the braces, so all of the game or the coding itself for this specific script needs to be within the braces. Currently, there are two functions set up. So we have a void start, which is going to be called at the start of the first frame in the scene, and then void update, which is called every frame as the game runs. We're going to right now create a third function called void fixed update. And make sure you put braces there to, which again, the braces for this specific function will be the coding that, so whatever you want to happen in the fixed happen, for the fixed update has to be within those braces. So for the game object to interact and move, we need to give it some variables as well as find the rigid body and then add forces to it and so on. So to start, we're going to add a couple of variables. So public float speed, and we're going to give it a value of 5f. And we are also going to create a public float called jump force. And we are also going to give it a value of 5f. Now, if you're using floats, the floats allow you to use decimals. So this could be 5.5, it could be 8.2, it could be whatever. If you wanted an int, you could simply change this to a public int and make it equal to 5, but you would not be able to use decimal values. So for now, I'm going to just leave these as floats, and then the f, you do need to identify that it is a float. So if we save this, shrink this down, go back into the game. So in the game, we have a null reference exception. So right now we can just clear these. Under the player controller, you can see that we have those variables that are created now. So because these are public floats, we can access them through here, as well as they can be accessed from anywhere within the game. So normally what is done in coding for games is that these are all made as private variables. So if we go back into the script itself, we want to make these private. Now you could just simply say private float, which will make it disappear over here, and the only way you will be able to access it is through the script itself. But we do want to be able to access it so that when you manipulate these, so you can play through the game, move your character, change these values over here, and make sure that your movements look right. So to do that, we need to serialize it. So serialize field in square brackets, and then a private float. And the serialize and field both do need to be capitalized. Similarly, we'll do the same for the jump force. So serialize field in square brackets, and this is also a private float. With those variables, now we want to apply these forces to the game object. So we need to find the rigid body. So private rigid body 2D and then give it a name. So it's just identifying, so it's a private rigid body and we're calling it RB. Now, where is the rigid body? So for this specific script with your player, so because it's attached to the player at the start of the frame, at the start of the scene, we want to find that rigid body. So in order to do that, our RB equals get component, and then using the arrows, we're going to get the rigid body 2D, and then close those with the parentheses. So what these arrows in the parentheses refers to is that we're finding a component over here. So it's going to get this rigid body. If you wanted to get the sprite renderer, you would do the same thing. So you'd want to say private sprite renderer and then call it sprite. And then down here you'd say sprite get component, and then same as here except instead of rigid body you'd say sprite renderer. And what that could allow you to do is then you can change some of the values, so you can manipulate the colors and so on. Similarly, we could change values for this rigid body, but for now we're going to leave everything the way it is. From there now we want to, so now we have access to the rigid body and the forces, but we want them to interact. So when you hit the arrow keys is when your character is going to be able to move. So in the update, that's where every frame it's going to be updating, are you hitting the arrow keys and in which direction? So what we want to do is create a private float, and we're going to call it move HD. So this is the movement in the horizontal direction. And then in the update, that's where we're going to do this. So you want to be doing this in the update and not in the start, because you want to be constantly checking, what is the input? Are you hitting the left or right arrow key? For the rigid body, we only need to find that the once. So move HD equals, and for this it's input dot get axis raw, and then in brackets and in quotes horizontal. And the horizontal does need to be capitalized. So this is using the inputs within Unity itself. So if we go to in the project itself, so edit, project settings, we can look at the input manager, and it's using this horizontal here, which just means that it's using the right and left arrow keys. So left means it's going negative or it's going to the left side, and right is a positive button, which means it's going to the right. So it's going to apply a positive 1 or a negative 1 force. And with this now we have the input, right? So when are you hitting the left and right arrow key? So now what we want to do is apply those forces to it. So when you're applying forces to the rigid body, it's generally done in the fixed update. So in order to do that, we can do all the coding here. However, I'm going to do it slightly different. So we're going to create two methods called move player. So it creates a method called move player. And then similarly, we're going to create a method called jump. Nope, not jump force. So it auto kind of puts that in. Okay, that's fine. Let's go back. So creates the jump. So this is going to create two methods that through the fixed update, it's going to now run, okay, move the player and apply the physics to the rigid body. So now underneath there, we need to create those methods. So we want to create a private void move player. And with the parentheses, it identifies it as a method. Put your braces in, because again, the coding within, so for this specific method, it's whatever is in these braces is what is going to be run. Similarly, we want to create a private void jump. And again, put your braces in there. So now what we want to do is move the player. Spelled that wrong. So private void. Okay, so the error that's showing up here is so it's showing an error here. What I forgot to do on this specific line is I forgot to put my semicolon. So if you put your semicolon in, it'll fix that error. So it's just, it wasn't ending this code. So you need to end the code and then the braces ends this function. So now that we have the move player and the jump methods identified, so in the move player, we want to now move the player. So if and then brackets. So if the move HD is greater than 0, and then put your braces, and again, the coding for this specific, if you're moving to the right or if the right arrow key is pushed, what happens? So we want to move the player. So if the right arrow key is pushed, the rigid body, so our rigid body velocity is going to change, and we're going to create a new vector 2. And for the new vector 2, we are going to do the move HD multiplied by the speed. And then for the y direction, we want to stay constant. So rb.velocity.y. So that will maintain the y velocity, so the y direction is not being affected by this movement. Similarly, if move HD is less than 0, in the braces, we want to, what is going to happen? So the same thing, we can just take this and copy it down. It's the same code except for the movement direction. So you move HD direction, it's going to be to the left and then multiplied by the speed. So now if we save this file, save the controller, go back to the game and let it compile. So once it compiles, when we hit play, we will be able to clear out those. So when we hit play, we will be able to move our character to the left and right. And, oh, that's right. So one of the things I forgot to do as well, so right now your character spins around, which is probably not what you want to happen. If you had a character that, like a ball or one that did roll, that might be fine. But we do need to freeze, so for your player, rigid body, we want to freeze the z-axis, which just means that it's not going to spin around as it was. So if we go back and hit play now, we can move our character left and right. So now that we have our player moving left and right, we are going to add the jump force. Actually, before we do that, if you notice as we moved, he only moved to the right, or always face the right. So when you move to the left, your character was not moving or didn't change the directions. So for your player, so up here you have a transform position, which we'll be using kind of that transform.position to look at where things are located. And then similarly, we have a transform scale. So the 1, 1, 1 just means that it's, so whatever the way it's set, that's the normal. So what we want to do is rotate it in the y-axis. So we want to flip it so that it's -1, which will then, so if I put a -1 there, it flips the character so that it's facing left. So what we can do now is so when it's moving left, we want to transform dot local scale. So we're transforming the local scale, and all we're doing is making this a new vector 2. So this vector 2 is not moving it in the xy direction. So it's not moving the character, it's changing the object itself in that xy direction. So we want to make this -1, 1. So it'll flip the sprite to make it so that it's facing the left when you're moving left. Now if you do that, it's not going to be able to flip back right. So we need to go up into the when you're moving to the right. So when move HD is greater than 0, we want to do the same thing, but make it so that it's +1. So local transform.local scale equals new vector 2. And this time we want this to be 1 and 1. So this will allow your character to flip back so that it's facing to the right. Now to add the jump forces, we want to, when you are inputting a certain key, what happens? So in this case, we're going to use the space key. So for the jump, what you want to do is if input dot get key down. So if input dot get, actually I'm going to just use dot get key. So if input dot get key, and then in brackets key dot code, so key dot code, and then period. No, sorry, that's not right. So if key code, and then period space. So if the input, so we're getting a key, so what's the input? So what's the key? So the key code is space. If you wanted to use the A, you could just say get key and then key code A. Make sure the A is capital. If you put lowercase, it won't find it. So these need to be capital. So you could put D or whatever. So I'm going to use the space. So if we are hitting the space, what happens, right? So again, if the space is hit, what is going to happen? So again, we want to change the velocity. So rb.velocity, so the rigid body velocity equals new vector 2, and then we're going to apply that force to it. So this time we want the velocity in the y direction, so rb.velocity.x is going to be the same. So the velocity in the x direction is the same, but we want the change in the y direction. And to do that, for y, we are going to put the jump force as the y direction. And then close out that code with your semicolon. And so save your controller script. We can shrink this down. Okay, so transform does not contain a definition for local sale. Clearly I have a typo there. So that is on, and again, you can check this as, so line 36, so local scale. Make sure I spelled that one right, yes. And save it again. And now when you hit play, you will be able to, or should be able to, move your character left and right, as well as jump by hitting the space key. So we can move left, faces, or sorry, move right, faces right, move left, faces left. Similarly, we can jump. Right, one thing you can notice is we can constantly hit the space button, which will, or hold the space button down for that matter, and you will always be jumping. Your character will always be jumping. So right now what you can do, so don't worry about that, we will fix that in the next video, the next tutorial. But what you can do is, as you are playing this, so when you're in play, you can, I want you to manipulate these values so that it gives you where you feel like your movement is accurate or it's comfortable in terms of it. So you can manipulate the values here. So when you're in play, so we can change the speed to 10, and let's change the jump force to 10. We can add some linear drag, so it was actually a 1. Yours might be set to 0 as your drag. We can change the scale, so gravity, let's add more gravity, and so on. You can add mass to your character, and then go back, just make sure you click back in the game view, and then see how your character jumps, and so on. So when it feels right in terms of the movement, so for example, if you have 0 drag, your character will slide quite a bit more, right? So it kind of slides around the ground. So play with that, and in the next video we will come back and we'll look at moving the camera. So right now, if you play it, you can move off the screen and you're gone from the view, right? So we'll look at moving the camera, as well as, you know, fixing that jump part where you need to be on the ground in order to jump. So that will conclude this video, and in the next one we'll go over those features.